Set.
Good morning and welcome to this 4-minute mull, which I'm doing fairly early in the morning in South Africa. Sorry if that affects my voice, but I thought that I would get this out there because today is the day where the IAAF is expected to announce a new policy to try and regulate women athletes with high testosterone levels. So this is the so-called hyperandrogeism policy. And what we have seen, and this dates back all the way to November last year, is that the policy will basically cover a very specific range of events. And so any female athlete competing in the 400, 400 hurdles, 800 and 1500 will have to lower their testosterone levels in order to be eligible for racing and medals and prizes and records. Now, there's going to be a lot of controversy about this. There has been for 9 years. So why would it stop now? I wish it did. I want to spend this 4-minute mile just addressing some of the key questions that have been asked in the last few days when this announcement became known. And I hope that in doing that, I can share with you a little bit of insight around why we've arrived at this point, what happens now, and then what is likely, in my opinion, to happen next. So first question, what is the policy? What does it actually say? It says that any female with high levels of testosterone who competes in events ranging from 400 meters up to the mile is only allowed to do so once they have lowered their testosterone levels below a concentration of 5 nanomoles per liter. Now, if you remember the history of this issue, in 2012, the IAAF had a policy which covered all the athletics events. And so any female in any event had to lower their testosterone to a value of 10 nanomole per liter. So they are bringing in the same concept, which is that there's an upper limit for testosterone, but that ceiling has now been lowered from 10 to 5. That's based on some separate policies that the IOC has recently announced regarding transgender athletes. But the premise basically is that if you are a female competing in 400, 800, 1500 mile, you have to now have a testosterone level that is lower than 5. Otherwise, you're not eligible for records, titles, medals, etc. Next question, and perhaps the obvious follow-up, why those events? Why from 400 to the mile? Why not 5,000 upwards? Why not 100, 200? Why not field events? Well, that's because, and very briefly, do you remember when the Court of Arbitration set aside the previous policy? In 2015, an Indian sprinter called Duty Chand challenged the IAAF's policy at the time, saying that it was unfair and there was no evidence to support that high testosterone improved performance. That case was heard by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and at the risk of massively oversimplifying their decision, because it was a many page document, they concluded that in fact there was no scientific evidence at that time which allows the IAAF to have what they deemed to be a discriminatory policy. So because that policy applied to women athletes only, it was discriminatory, and according to law, if you have something that's discriminatory, you have to have strong evidence to support it. The Court of Arbitration decided that that evidence did not exist, and so they set aside that policy, but they mandated the IAAF, or they gave the IAAF an opportunity to go away over a period of 2 years and come back with evidence that allowed them to reinstate or to replace their high testosterone policy. This announcement today is the culmination or the outcome of that research. And so what the IAAF did is they went to the World Championships in 2011 and they measured the testosterone levels of every athlete, men and women, in those champs. They then asked the question, can we find events where having high testosterone gives women an advantage over those who have low testosterone? And so they divided them into highest third and lowest third, and they compared those groups. Now, there are many scientific statistical questions around that study, which I won't go into in this video. But what they eventually found is that there were 5 events in which high testosterone outperformed low testosterone. They were 400, 400 hurdles, 800 track, hammer throw, pole vault, field. So that kind of explains why they've narrowed it down to some events only. What it doesn't explain is why the policy has included the 1500, because there was no evidence from their own study that a 1500 meter performance was improved by having high testosterone compared to lowest testosterone. So I don't know why that is. I also don't know why the hammer throw and the pole vault have apparently not been included in that list of events that are now governed by this policy. So That's the kind of thing where we have to wait to see exactly what their rationale is, exactly what their evidence is. But it is also the reason that so many people have looked at that and said, but this is a Semenya policy, because why have you added the 1500 if it's not to try and prevent one athlete from competing? And I fully get that appearance. It does really look as though this policy has been designed specifically to stop Caster Semenya from competing. Now, I don't know if that's true. I would be surprised. I can't bring myself to imagine a group of lawyers and doctors and scientists sitting around a table in Monaco somewhere saying, how do we stop Semenya from running? Given everything in the last 9 years, I cannot see how that would possibly be the case. I suppose one should never be surprised by sports governance, but that would genuinely shock me if they were inviting that much criticism. So I think that they have tried to do something based on their own evidence. Remember that because of CAS's decision, they've got a very narrow mandate. They are specifically required to have evidence to support a policy. And that explains why it's covering only certain events. They can't put the 100 and the long jump and the 5,000 on because they don't have the evidence. The question is, why did they put the 1,500 on? Is it Semenya specific or is it logistical? And that we need to wait to see with their own rationale before we leap to conclusions. And then the third question, which is the final one that I'll address in this video, is what happens next. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of speculation here because we don't know exactly where this saga takes us next. But I think in the short term, the IAAF announced this policy, which they can do, by the way, without having to go back to CAS, because this policy doesn't affect Duty Chand and the previous CAS hearings. It effectively bypasses that. And presumably Duty Chand, because she's unaffected as a 100-meter, 200-meter runner, will say no worries, no problem, and the policy gets to go in without CAS's approval or re-evaluation. If that happens, I strongly suspect that someone, whether that is Caster Semenya or whether that is another athlete who's affected by this policy, someone will take the IAAF back to CAS, and so we will have round 2, this time judging this evidence and this policy. Now, if that happens, it will be very interesting to see how CAS evaluates the evidence. As I said earlier, there are some question marks around that study that the IAAF did, around the statistics used and the method that they used. My own feeling is that it's quite a weak study for reasons, again, that I'm not going to go into here, but basically they're comparing high testosterone and low testosterone when we know that there are actually very small differences between those groups because women's testosterone ranges are quite constrained, with the exception of extreme outliers. So I think the whole premise of the study was actually flawed to begin with. However, the key point is that if you go back to the CAS decision in 2015, they mention many times that the key issue is the degree of the advantage. In other words, how big is the benefit, the advantage of having these high testosterone levels compared to normal female testosterone levels. And frequently in that document, there is this discussion around 10 to 12% being the difference between males and females in sport. Now, the IAAF's evidence, which I showed you previously, in those 5 events, finds a difference in performance of between 2 and 4%. So 2 to 4% compared to 10 to 12, in my opinion, is not big enough. I think that if this goes to CAS, CAS will rule that the advantage is not large enough. It only occurs in a handful of events. The fact that it doesn't exist in other events suggests that testosterone is not performance advantage. And by the way, I disagree with that. I think it is. I think that's an artifact of the way they did the study. I think that the testosterone advantage is actually quite large. But I don't think that CAS will judge that, and I don't think the evidence that the IAAF has suggests that. And so therefore, I strongly suspect that if this goes to CAS, if we find ourselves back at the courts, whether it's, again, Semenya or someone else, I would be very surprised if this new policy stands up to a legal challenge, because I think, if anything, it's a little bit weaker than the one that went before it. And so I fully expect that they'll implement it, they'll be challenged, and then they'll have to do away with it. And perhaps that will bring to an end this controversy and this issue, because, quite frankly, the science is not capable of providing an answer to this question in an ethical, reasoned way, and I think they probably have to abandon the premise. And just a final point that I want to leave you with, and that's around the principle of trying to regulate this. Now, for 9 years, I've held this position, and it's not changing now just on the basis that I think that this evidence and this policy is weak and will be overturned and should be overturned. I believe that the regulation is required. I believe that if you have a category for men's and women's sport, there needs to be some delineation, some way of protecting the line or the boundary between those categories. If you don't have it, then you might as well get rid of the categories. It's the same as if we have weight categories in boxing. We can't allow the 96 kilogram boxer to fight against the 62 kilogram boxer just because he has a natural advantage. We have a weight class for a reason. It's to protect the integrity, the safety, the fairness of competition. And therefore, if we have a category, we must defend it. So I support the idea of trying to defend the boundary between two categories. And I think, as I've said before, the testosterone was the best way to do that. However, the science cannot provide the level of support, the level of evidence that the court is demanding. And for that reason, we're probably going to have to abandon the pursuit of trying to defend that line and just say, you compete where you identify, go for it. This argument here has been made for 9 years, and it really frustrates me. Because you see, we don't compete in categories of height for basketball. Therefore, we don't regulate and prevent the person who's taller from playing it. We don't compete in categories of fast twitch muscle fiber in sprinting. And so therefore, we don't say that Usain Bolt has an unfair advantage. We don't compete for large shoulders or big feet in swimming. So therefore, it's not subject to the discussion that is valid and required around men's versus women's sport. And if you want to adopt this position, I hope that you understand that the ultimate extension, the implication of this argument, is that there should be no attempt to categorize or regulate sports at all. No weight classes, no male or female sports classes. In other words, if it's all about a natural advantage, as these people argue, then we should just have everyone compete in one race and we should crown the 100-meter champion of the world. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female, and you know what will happen. They'll all be men. But that's a natural advantage, and it's genetics. He had a Y chromosome, lucky him. That's the extension. That's what you're arguing for with this kind of, in my opinion, foolish logic. And as I say, it's been 9 years, and I wish it would stop. Anyway, that's my 4-minute mull for today. We'll see what happens. The reaction, I'm sure, will be swift. There'll be lots of outrage, lots of misinformation. I hope that this helps to some extent to clarify the confusion. Thanks.